She started planned to be in the Navy, one of the lads in navy blue. All for a life on the ocean wavy, 'cause in the Navy you get the gravy. We love to do our duty for England's home and beauty, especially beauty. She started planned to be in the Navy, one of the lads in navy blue. You've heard songs about the boys in khaki.
This is the voice of Effie Fellows, Perth's first international entertainer. From this audio, you might think Effie was a singer perhaps, and although that's true, she was much more. Effie Fellows was a male impersonator, known as the perfect boy. My name is Holly Ferguson, and this is the story of Effie Fellows.
You keep our vital lifelines free, moulding for the Empire's security. There'll always be an England while Britannia rides the sea, side by side with the men of the merchant navy.
During the early to mid-1900s, male impersonators were some of the most popular entertainers in the Western world. But what made Effie and other male impersonators so fashionable? To find out more about the phenomenon of male impersonators, I spoke with Perth theatre historian Ivan King, who is the curator of the Museum of Performing Arts at His Majesty's Theatre in Perth. Ivan has an extensive collection on male impersonators and has previously created exhibitions all about them. Why were male impersonators popular entertainers in the late 19th to early 20th centuries?
I can't give you a concise, succinct answer to that because I've never been able to pin it down completely. I put it down to the morality of the time, the strictly suppressed sexuality of the time, the Victorian morals which carried over into the 20th century. Apparently, and I was talking to an English performer of vintage years, said that the blokes in the audience got a bit of a turn on seeing women dressed as men.
What did their acts consist of, and where were they usually performed?
They were performed in variety shows and vaudeville shows. It wasn't an entire night of Effie Fellows or of Ella Shields or of Hetty King. The sorts of productions that you would have seen these male impersonators in were a variety show. You'd open with a few chorus girls doing a dance, you'd have a juggler, you'd have a comedian, you'd have a novelty act, you'd have something else, and then the first half would close with a 20-minute appearance of, say, Effie Fellows or Ella Shields, closing the first half, because these people were topping the bill. And then you'd repeat in the second act, and then they would come on for the finale. So you didn't get a whole hour and a half of undiluted male impersonator. They were the principal act in a variety of acts.
What kind of audience did they attract? What was their demographic?
Well, the demographic was the average audience who would go to a show at Perth Arena, I would say, who would go to a vaudeville show, who would tune into a late-night variety show on television today. The general public, the audience that went to the vaudeville theatres, and like the Luxor, Tivoli, over the line in Beaufort Street.
For most male impersonators, like Hetty King and Ella Shields, their transitions into vaudeville and performing came from family backgrounds in the entertainment industry. However, Effie's journey to vaudeville was different. Effie was born in 1898. Her father, who was a graphic artist, had recently moved the family from Melbourne to Perth in an attempt to find work. The family settled on Coghlan Road in Subiaco, and Effie attended Subiaco Primary School. Effie was a peculiar child with a wild spirit. Much to the dismay of her mother, at her father's studio she would often wear his cap and scarf, paint a moustache onto her face, and would insist her name was Tommy. Throughout her years in school, Effie began to show the signs of being a performer, entering and winning singing competitions. Upon leaving school, Effie's tomboyish persona became more serious as she took up several jobs as a boy.
Right from the start, she was quirky. I mean, she got a job as a bellboy, a bellhop at the Palace Hotel on the corner of the Terrace and William Street. And she just loved dressing up as a bloke.
Following her jobs at the convent and the Palace Hotel, Effie joined the illusionist the great Fasola and his company before attempting to be a stowaway on a steamer boat bound for America. This was the last straw for her parents, who decided to send Effie to live with her grandfather in Melbourne. On the train ride over, Effie presented herself once again as an orphan boy named Freddie. Her act was so convincing that a passenger wanted to adopt her. Effie went home with this passenger and took a job at a news agency, where she was given boyish duties, including delivering newspapers. Following a driving accident on Prince's Bridge, Effie decided to give up her act as Freddie and finally visit her grandfather. With only male attire when she arrived at her grandfather's home, she gave her brother's name. Although confused as to why his grandson didn't write to say he was arriving from Perth, he welcomed Effie in. Quickly, Effie admitted to who she really was, and her sympathetic grandfather offered his help. Soon, Effie was in female attire again and decided to head home to Perth. When she arrived home, Effie finally gained the permission from her parents to pursue a career as a male impersonator. Beginning with shows in Perth, she quickly made a name for herself and headed to other areas around Australia and the world.
She went east and she went on the circuit. She had wanderlust, obviously, and played all the variety theatres all over the Western world. In Egypt, she was in South Africa, all the British music hall circuit. She played in America a couple of times. Over east, I've got a poster of her playing Sydney as a support act to a silent movie.
While performing in Tasmania, Effie piqued the fancy of a French clown named Pico, who would soon become her first husband. Herself and Pico travelled and performed globally together, which was an incredibly uncommon thing for people to do.
What did it mean, or what was it like for someone to travel globally during the early 1900s?
There were no 15-hour flights to London, were there? They'd have spent a lot of time on steam trains. I imagine on the long sea voyages they would do a bit of shipboard entertaining. You couldn't say you're playing Perth tonight and you'll be opening in Adelaide on Friday. You'd have the trip across the Nullarbor or around the Bight in a steamship. We're talking in terms of Australia. In England, of course, it'd be just half-hour train ride between towns and cities. But here, it'd probably be very primitive, particularly if you're doing the regional towns like Ballarat and Bendigo and so forth.
Press images from Effie's performances demonstrate how her act transformed during her travels, from an urchin character who would sell newspapers to a top hat wearing gentleman.
What kind of performances did she do? What type of songs?
Her most famous one was I've Never Seen a Straight Banana, and raucous comedy songs.
For years and years and years I kept on searching, but I always seem to have bad luck somehow. To find the thing I'm searching for, all around this world I've been, and now I'm going to tell you what it is I've never seen. Well, I've never, ever, I've never seen a straight banana. I searched every town, I've seen bananas standing up, I've seen them lying down. I've searched everywhere to find one, Africa, Jamaica and Havana, but I've never, ever, I've never seen a straight banana.
And then she'd always finish off with a very sentimental ballad, about love and I'll miss you and goodbye and farewell, my heart is broken, after having done about 5 or 6 numbers Then she let you see her soft side as she went off stage.
I felt that it had to be. So it's a day I'm ready. I'll be at the church to see. I won't tell a soul I love you. I won't even mention your name. For I know I've been a fool, dear, and I've only myself to blame. I won't tell a soul I miss you. No memories will always remain of you and the night you whisper. I can't ever see you again. I suppose I should wish you luck, but I haven't the heart to try. So just for tonight, my heart will be broken in trying to say goodbye. So think of me sometime, darling. Remember when we're far apart. I won't tell a soul I love you, though I'm left with a broken heart.
In 1922, Pico and Effie came back to Perth, where they parted ways. Pico sailed to England while Effie went to Sydney. It's there where she met her future partner, boxing promoter Sammy Chapman.
Her partner for the rest of her life was a very big New Zealand former boxer who coached the New Zealand boxing team, and the both of them went to see that team perform at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. No doubt they got a glimpse of Hitler while they were there.
As a headlining act, Effie received wide press coverage everywhere she went, including interviews such as this.
And right on time for her appointment at Memory Corner tonight is world-traveled male impersonator Effie Fellows. Oh, Effie, my word. You're the smartest little naval officer we've ever had on this program.
Thanks, Glad. It's great to see you again. When was the last time? 1922 in Melbourne.
Yes, and the time before that was in 1916 in Johannesburg. And you were playing in vaudeville with the South African Theatre Trust, remember?
That's right, lad. And you were playing in Betty at Her Majesty's.
Yes, and just before you went to Africa, Betty, you were under... I'm thinking of Betty. Effie. You were appeared under the late Sir Benjamin Fuller banner, didn't you?
Right, a male impersonator. But in those days, I was more of a boy impersonator. The late Sir Ben organised a stunt for me in Martin Place. I'd be dressed as a schoolboy and would mingle with the crowd. And if anybody recognised me, they just had to tap me on the shoulder and get the prize.
Oh, I suppose there were quite a few cases of mistaken identity.
I'll say there were. Everybody wanted to get the prize. A big lad of about 17 walking along Castlereagh Street. They thought, that'll be Effie Fellows. And they chased this poor, unfortunate boy right through the Hotel Australia.
Despite her busy and exciting career, Effie never forgot home and often came back to visit.
She kept coming back to Perth to perform at the Luxor Theatre, which was near the Court Hotel, just over the Beaufort Street Bridge. And she sort of topped the bill every time she came back, and full of wonderful stories about her trips, her international adventures. And I can just imagine her sitting there regaling the local performers. She'd never been further than Kalgoorlie or Rottnest.
What impact did her success have on Perth?
Well, I don't know if it was an impact. You can just say that she was this isolated city's first international entertainer. I think that's how we must look at it. Our first international entertainer. I don't know if her act would stand up today, quite frankly. Her repertoire of songs, her patter, As I have said before, these performers made a living just going from town to town, repeating the same songs over and over again to an audience as big as the theatres would allow, like say from 300 to about 800. They do those songs today on television. They'd play to 1 million and they've exhausted their repertoire. On television they'd have a career probably that would last a week or a month. As it was back then, they could get a living out of repeating a song over 10, 20 years.
Within the last 2 decades, pop culture has embraced drag queens, otherwise known as female impersonators, into mainstream society, with well-known personalities such as RuPaul and Australia's Courtney Act having their own TV shows. However, the continuation of male impersonation hasn't developed or sustained itself in the way female impersonation has.
It's hard to pinpoint this, I know, but what do you think happened to male impersonation? Why did the art form essentially die out?
That I would like to know, but they seem to disappear with the death of Effie Fellows and a couple of Australian-born male impersonators who played the circuit endlessly in the 30s and 40s, and they went out with the beginnings of television, I'd say. There's nothing left. The whole phenomenon just died a natural death.
Remnants of male impersonation can be seen in the niche world of drag kings, with performers who mostly identify amongst the LGBT+ community and perform in gay venues, which is vastly different to the demographic of their predecessors and their popularity.
Today, people involved in drag or cross-dressing usually identify as queer. Was that also the case for these male impersonators?
No, I don't think it. No, because they were all married, and they made sure they let you know that they were married. In fact, one married a British aristocrat, and she was Lady So and So off stage, and that was evident in the promotions that they did in face creams and beauty products. They let you see the feminine side of their personalities.
Effie left the stage in the 1940s and decided to retire at home in Perth.
What was her involvement in the community during her retirement?
Well, I don't think she could be involved. This probably was the sadness of it all. I've seen it myself. People who've travelled the world and done wonderful, wonderful, miraculous, colourful things, and they come home and they tell people about them, and the people aren't really interested, or if they go to, once they've told them, they've got no conversation left. They have very little in common with the people who stayed behind. One anecdote I do remember is the actress Maggie King, and she and her sister Joan Sidney were living in Subiaco when they first came here, and they said they see this strange little woman walking down the road whistling, going into the shop to buy a bottle of milk, the corner shop, cracking a few gags, and then going off and again whistling, still performing. That's all she had to offer, I would say, because she couldn't talk local politics, she couldn't talk about mothers and grandchildren and so forth, or she hadn't lived an everyday life. So I imagine her only terms of reference would be, I did such and such in New York, or I did such and such in London, or I did such and such in South Africa. And all these people that she associated with, all they could talk about would be their Perth experiences. So I imagine it would be a very, very frustrating and lonely existence coming back then to Perth.
I'm currently outside of Effie's family home in Subiaco on Coghlan Road. The original house no longer exists. It's been replaced by a modern-looking terrace along with the houses around it, but This is where Effie grew up. It's where her parents continued to live when she was travelling the world, and where she would visit when she came back to Perth. Often her parents would have celebrations for her when she would visit, and one story I really like is that her dad, who was an artist, painted all the lemons on their tree gold for her as part of one of the homecomings. I imagine that he must have been so proud of her entire family and the community. The house is part of a self-guided walking tour that you can do through Subiaco, but there's no plaque outside the house or on the fence that says this is where the Effie Fellows lived and grew up. Also on the tour is the Home of Peace near Kings Park, which was a home for the chronically ill and elderly, and that was where Effie retired and spent her final days until she died in 1977. She's said to have performed right up through her retirement and until her death, and I have no doubt that she would have still been singing her most popular song, I've Never Seen a Straight Banana.
One thing that I've not seen up to now. For years and years and years I kept on searching, but I always seem to have bad luck somehow. To find the thing I'm searching for all around this world I've been, and now I'm going to tell you what it is I've never seen. Well, I've never, ever, I've never seen a straight banana. I searched every town, I've seen bananas standing up, I've seen them lying down. I've searched everywhere to find one, Africa, Jamaica and Havana, but I've never, ever, I've never seen a straight banana. Oh, I've seen cabbages I have with knobs on, and lovely red tomatoes turning blue. I might say I've seen scarlet runners running, I've seen them when they couldn't walk too. I've seen nice new potatoes with their eyes all filled with tears, because an onion friend of mine got sentenced to 3 years. But I've never, ever, I've never seen a straight banana. I searched every town, I've seen bananas standing up, I've seen them lying down. I've searched everywhere to find one, Africa, Jamaica and Havana, but I've never, ever,